Before there was a revolutionary, before there was a leader who would shake the world, there was simply a boy. A boy named Toussaint, born into a world already marked by the struggles of generations before him. Toussaint's story began not on the sun-scorched fields of Saint-Domingue, but much earlier, across the Atlantic, in the kingdoms of West Africa. His father, Hippolyte, was no ordinary man in his homeland. Legends whispered through the years would claim that he was the son of Gaou Guignou, a figure tied to the nobility of the Alada kingdom. Perhaps even royalty, though the truth of bloodlines often blurs when passed through the memories of time. What is certain is this: Hippolyte had once walked among the powerful. In Alada, to be called Deguinon, meaning old man or wise man, was a mark of status, a title that suggested counsel and dignity. Hippolyte, and perhaps his father before him, had been men of influence. But in an age where the world's empires were built upon conquest, no station was safe. The kingdom of Dahomey, rising in power, launched brutal campaigns against its neighbors. Wars of expansion, fueled by the hunger for domination and the lure of European trade goods, swept through Alada like wildfire. In the chaos, Hippolyte and his first wife, Catherine, were captured, torn from their lives, their identities, their future. Separated, shackled, stripped of their pasts, they were sold to French slavers. The ship that bore them away, the Hermione, carried more than bodies. It carried broken dynasties, sundered families, lost histories. When Hippolyte arrived in Saint-Domingue, the past was wiped away with the stroke of a pen. Under the Code Noir, the brutal law that governed the colony's labor force, he was forced to renounce his name, his traditions, his beliefs. He was baptized into the Catholic faith, assigned a new name plucked from fashionable Latin and Greek inspirations: Hippolyte. A man reborn, but only in the cruelest sense. Pauline, Toussaint's mother, shared a similar fate. She hailed from the Aja people, another proud lineage swallowed by the tides of conquest and displacement. Together, they built a fragile life in a world that had erased their pasts, but could not extinguish their spirit. Into this world Toussaint was born, their eldest son. A boy given a European name, but carrying within him the echoes of Africa, the stubborn pride of lost kingdoms, and the quiet strength of a people who refused to be forgotten. In the fields and forests of Saint-Domingue, Toussaint grew up hearing the whispers of a world he had never seen. The stories of who he might have been had the tides of fate been kinder. These whispers did not embitter him. They forged him. They gave him an invisible armor, a sense that though he lived under foreign rule, something far greater stirred within his blood. He was not just a laborer, nor merely a survivor. He was the living bridge between a proud ancient heritage and an uncertain, dangerous future. A future he would one day seize with both hands. But for now, he waited. He listened. He learned. The time to act would come. And when it did, the world would remember his name. In the northern reaches of Saint-Domingue, nestled among the humid hills and fertile fields of Haut-du-Cap, there stood the Breda plantation. It was here, beneath the wide Caribbean sky, that Toussaint Louverture came into the world, a world bounded by the iron rhythms of plantation life. The plantation was not merely a place of toil. It was the stage upon which the first chapters of Toussaint's life unfolded. His parents, stripped of their pasts but unbowed in spirit, raised him among the towering sugarcane and whispering trees, alongside the brutal realities that shaped every breath they took. In the years that followed Toussaint's birth, his family grew. His parents welcomed 5 more children into their fold: Marie-Jean, Paul, Pierre, Jean, and João, the last named in quiet tribute to the grandfather whose memory still clung to their hearts. Of all his siblings, it was Paul, closest in age and spirit, who would become Toussaint's dearest companion, a brother bound by more than blood, but by shared dreams and whispered confidences under the vast tropical night. From their earliest days, the children were brought into the fold of the Catholic Church. Baptized by the Jesuits who ministered to the enslaved population, they were given the rites and rituals of a new faith, one that layered itself over the fading memories of the old gods and ancient ways. In the absence of his parents, whose passing left a silent, aching void, Toussaint found guidance in the hands of others. Pierre-Baptiste Simon, a carpenter by trade and gatekeeper of the Breda estate, stood at the crossroads of many lives. As Toussaint's godfather, and later a father figure, Pierre-Baptiste provided more than protection. He offered wisdom, quiet strength, and the living example of dignity under hardship. Alongside him stood Pelage, Toussaint's foster mother, who wove together the fractured strands of the Louverture family, ensuring that Toussaint and his siblings endured, and more importantly, that they remembered who they were. In the early years, Toussaint's voice carried the music of Africa. He spoke the Fon language, the tongue of the Alada people, the language of his ancestors, spoken in hushed tones among the elders of the plantation, a living thread connecting him to a lost homeland. But survival in Saint-Domingue demanded more than memories. As Toussaint grew, he adapted. He mastered the Creole French spoken in the bustling markets and along the winding paths of the colony. It was a rough, rhythmic language, shaped by many tongues, carrying the weight of survival and resilience. And then, as the winds of revolution began to stir, he took another bold step. He learned Standard French, the language of the Grands Blancs, the powerful elite who ruled over Saint-Domingue from their grand halls and white-columned estates. It was not simply a language. It was a key, a weapon, a new way to understand the world he would one day challenge. Each language he learned, each lesson he absorbed, became a brick in the foundation of the man he was becoming. Toussaint Louverture, once a boy whose life could have been lost in the endless shuffle of history, was, brick by brick, word by word, building something that no master, no empire, no betrayal would ever truly destroy. He was building destiny, and destiny was almost ready to awaken. In the early years, long before he would command armies or rewrite the fate of a nation, Toussaint Louverture bore a name of ridicule. Among the children of the Breda plantation, he was known as Fatras Bâton, the sickly stick, thin, small, wiry. His body seemed almost too frail for the harsh world he was born into. But appearances, as the world would learn, could be deceiving. Though slight in stature, Toussaint possessed a core of steel. His mind was quick, his will unbreakable, and he soon revealed a gift that would elevate him above the brutal ranks of field labor. On the wide grounds of the Breda estate, he discovered a natural skill with animals, an almost uncanny ability to handle the powerful horses and stubborn oxen that others struggled to master. It was this rare talent that changed the course of his early life. Recognizing his gift, the plantation's overseers assigned him a new path. Instead of the backbreaking, often lethal work in the sugarcane fields, Toussaint and his siblings were trained as domestic servants, while the fields were places of suffering, where a misstep could mean a whip's kiss or worse. The manor house and stables offered a different, if limited, kind of safety. Here, Toussaint became an equestrian and coachman, mastering the fine art of driving carriages and caring for the plantation's prized animals. But privilege, even slight, breeds resentment. In a world built on rigid hierarchies, Toussaint's pride and growing confidence made him a target and a fighter. The Petit Blanc, white commoners hired to work on the plantation, viewed him with suspicion and disdain. And Toussaint, ever unwilling to shrink beneath their gaze, met their hostility head-on. Records tell of a young Petit Blanc named Ferrer, who found himself on the losing side of Toussaint's fists. A dangerous act, in a society where punishment for such defiance could be swift and deadly. Yet Toussaint escaped retribution, protected by an unlikely ally. François-Antoine Béon de Libertat, the new overseer of Breda, saw something in the young coachman. Perhaps it was his talent, perhaps his spirit. But whatever the reason, Béon shielded Toussaint from punishment. Under Béon's stewardship, serving the interests of Pantaleon de Breda Jr. and the Grand Blanc elite, the Breda plantation became a place where Toussaint's flame could flicker just long enough without being snuffed out. And Toussaint tested the limits of that protection. In one bold incident, he confronted Berger, the plantation's attorney, over a matter of pride and principle. When Berger attempted to take one of Breda's horses beyond the bounds of the property without permission, Toussaint did not argue. He did not plead. He simply acted. With a strength that belied his slight frame, he threw Berger from the horse, an act of defiance so dangerous it bordered on suicidal. But once again, punishment did not fall. Instead, these early clashes became quiet forges, tempering Toussaint's character, sharpening his sense of justice, deepening his understanding that real power was not given. It was seized, guarded, and held by those willing to risk everything. Beneath the sickly frame of Fatras Bâton, a future titan was taking shape. Every ride across the fields, every skirmish against the petty tyrannies of the plantation, carved deeper the lines of the man he would become. He was learning not just how to survive, he was learning how to lead. And soon, very soon, the world would feel the stirrings of that unstoppable force. For generations, the image of Toussaint Louverture had been shrouded in a simple, powerful myth, that he had lived his entire life in bondage until the fires of revolution lit the skies of Saint-Domingue. It was a story of transformation, of sudden ascent from chains to command. But history, as it often does, later revealed a more intricate truth. In the quiet archives of the 20th century, a marriage certificate and baptismal record, dated between 1776 and 1777, emerged from the past. They told a different story. Toussaint had been free for decades before he took up the mantle of revolutionary leadership. Manumitted sometime between 1772 and 1776, likely under the watch of François-Antoine Béon de Libertat, Toussaint had carved out a life beyond the plantation walls long before the first shots of rebellion rang out. This discovery cast new light on a letter he had once penned to the French government in 1797, where he had stated, almost in passing, that he had been free for over 20 years. A quiet reminder that Toussaint's journey had been a long and deliberate climb, not a sudden leap. Upon his emancipation, he shed the plantation brand of servitude, but not its memory. He took the name Toussaint de Breda, a nod to the place that had shaped him, and a mark of his origins in a society where lineage and status were everything. Freed from bondage, Toussaint entered a world defined not by equality, but by delicate and dangerous hierarchies. He became part of the gens de couleur libres, the free people of color. They were a diverse and vibrant group, freed African descendants, mulattoes born of French planters and African mothers, and families whose bloodlines blended every shade of Saint-Domingue's turbulent past. They were not accepted as equals by the white colonists, nor fully embraced by those still bound in chains. They occupied a narrow, uncertain space, fiercely protective of their hard-won freedoms, fiercely tied to the island they called home. There was a saying among them: the French feel at home in France, the enslaved feel at home in Africa. But we feel at home here. It was not just a sentiment, it was a declaration of identity. Now, standing among them, Toussaint set his sights higher still. Inspired by the Grand Blancs, the white plantation owners who had amassed staggering fortunes, he sought to build his own legacy, not merely as a free man, but as a man of means and influence. He began carefully, methodically. He rented a small coffee plantation. 13 laborers worked its fields, souls who, like so many before them, carried the weight of history on their backs. Among them was a man who would one day become far more than a laborer: Jean-Jacques Dessalines. History would know him as a fierce warrior, a brutal general, a man whose name would be etched into the birth of Haiti itself. But here, in these early days, he was simply part of Toussaint's growing enterprise, a young man whose loyalty and fire Toussaint would one day mold into an unstoppable force. In these quiet, powerful years, Toussaint Louverture was laying the foundation of something extraordinary, not through grand speeches or sudden uprisings, but through patience, through strategy, through an understanding that true power was not seized in a single moment, but built layer by layer, like the steady raising of a fortress. The boy, called Fatras Bâton, was long gone. In his place stood a man of ambition, of vision, a man waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, no empire on earth would be ready. Even as Toussaint Louverture carved out a new existence in Saint-Domingue, far from the chains that had once bound him, life unfolded with all its complexity, its triumphs, and its heartbreaks. Somewhere between the years 1761 and 1777, amid the slow, grinding rhythms of plantation life and the cautious ambitions of the free, Toussaint found love, or what seemed to be love at least. Her name was Cécile. They stood together before the altar in a modest Catholic ceremony, the rituals of the church binding them as husband and wife. In those early days, hope must have seemed like something tangible, something they could hold between them like a new dawn. Together, they welcomed children into the world: Toussaint Jr., Gabrielle Toussaint, and Marie Marthe. Each birth was not just a celebration of life, but an act of quiet defiance, a declaration that their bloodline, born under the harsh sun of Saint-Domingue, would continue. Yet even freedom was a complicated thing in those days. In a world shaped by laws designed to entrap, the buying of others was sometimes one of the few legal paths to redemption. Toussaint, like many freed men, bought enslaved individuals, not to exploit them, but to liberate those he loved. Piece by piece, he stitched together a family torn by forces beyond their control. He bought the freedom of Cécile, of their children, of his sister, Marie-Jean, of his wife's siblings, even of a man named Jean-Baptiste, whose freedom allowed him the simple human dignity of marriage. But life, even for a man as determined as Toussaint, did not unfold without cracks and fractures. The plantation Toussaint had so carefully built struggled to turn a profit. The dream of wealth and status, modeled after the Grand Blanc and the élite gens de couleur, proved more elusive than he had hoped. Tensions within the home grew. Whispers turned into arguments. The bond that had once seemed unbreakable now strained under the weight of ambition and disappointment. Eventually, Cécile made a choice. She left him, seeking stability in the arms of a wealthy Creole planter. A man who could offer her a life Toussaint, for all his striving, could not yet provide. Toussaint, for his part, found solace elsewhere. A woman named Suzanne entered his life. History would remember her as his second wife, though no formal divorce from Cécile was ever recorded. Indeed, divorce was forbidden by the laws of the colony. Instead, the past was quietly buried. And Toussaint, ever the strategist, excised it from his memory. In later years, he spoke little, if at all, of Cécile or the family they had once built together. To the world, it was as if she, and the chapter they shared, had never existed. Only the patient work of future historians would uncover the quiet truths hidden beneath the myths. But in the heart of the man who would one day command armies and negotiate with empires, the lessons of love and loss endured. They hardened him. They refined him. They taught him that loyalty could not be assumed, that even the closest bonds could be broken by fortune's cruel hand, and that, in the end, survival was not only about strength of body, but about resilience of spirit. Toussaint Louverture was not merely shaping his destiny. Life itself was shaping him, preparing him for the storms that were even now gathering beyond the horizon. The revolution was coming, and Toussaint was almost ready to meet it. By 1782, Toussaint Louverture's life had entered a new phase. After the quiet collapse of his first marriage, he found a new partner in Suzanne Simone Baptiste, a woman believed to be either his cousin or the daughter of his godfather, Pierre Baptiste, whose steady presence had long anchored the Louverture family. Together, they built a household that, over the years, would swell with life. Toussaint, in his later years, would confess to General Caffarelli that he had fathered at least 16 children across his 2 marriages and several relationships. Though tragedy followed close behind, with 11 of those children lost before his own death. Loss was no stranger to Toussaint. In 1785, sorrow came to him once again. His eldest son, Toussaint Jr., only 24 years old, was struck down by a fever. In the grief-stricken days that followed, the Louverture family organized a solemn Catholic funeral, one final tribute to a life extinguished too soon, presided over by a local priest, as a personal favor to the devout father. Not long after, the name of Gabriel Toussaint, the second son from his first marriage, vanished from the historical record. It is believed he too fell to the same cruel illness that took his brother, leaving Marie Marthe as the last surviving child from those earlier years. Yet even as death claimed much, life continued to emerge in unexpected ways. Suzanne's eldest child, Placide, carried a shadowed lineage. Though widely believed to have been fathered by a Creole planter named Seraphim Leclerc, Placide was embraced and adopted by Toussaint, raised as if no bloodline separated them. It was a decision born not of necessity, but of choice. a reflection of Toussaint's belief that loyalty and family were things one could forge, even if they were not inherited. Together, Toussaint and Suzanne would have two sons of their own, Isaac, born in 1784, and Saint-Jean, born 7 years later in 1791. Yet even these children, born to a man who had tasted freedom, would remain shackled by the laws of the land. For throughout the 1780s, Toussaint had been fighting a quieter war, a battle to rebuild his fortune, to reclaim what had been lost in the ruins of his failed coffee plantation. In these years, Toussaint made a deliberate choice to return to the Breda plantation. There, among old friends and the fragments of family that still remained, he re-established himself as a vital part of daily life. Not as a laborer in the fields, but as a salaried employee. He tended the livestock, cared for the prized horses, and slowly, patiently, expanded his responsibilities, becoming a muleteer, a master miller, and, perhaps most tellingly, a slave driver tasked with organizing the workforce. It was a precarious position, balancing ambition with compassion, survival with principle. By 1789, change was stirring not only in Toussaint's life, but across the plantation itself. The Breda family, seeking to divide their assets among new heirs, threatened to scatter the people of the estate like seeds upon the wind. Fearing for those he loved, Toussaint acted with characteristic boldness. He purchased a young woman, only 22, and traded her to the Bredas, in exchange for sparing his foster mother, Pelage, from being sold to an uncertain fate. It was a quiet, desperate transaction, executed not for profit, but for love. And through it all, Toussaint was not merely surviving. He was building. By the eve of revolution, he had accumulated a modest fortune. He bought a plot of land adjacent to the Breda property and raised a house for his growing family. Nearly 48 years old, Toussaint Louverture stood at the threshold of something vast, something he could feel in the air, like the rising pressure before a storm. The old world was trembling, and soon the storm would break. And when it did, Toussaint Louverture would not merely weather it, he would command it. On the surface, Toussaint Louverture's rise to greatness might have seemed a mystery, a leap from obscurity to legend. But beneath that ascent lay years of quiet, relentless preparation. Years spent sharpening a mind that would one day outwit generals and governors alike. At the heart of this hidden education stood a man named Pierre Baptiste, Toussaint's godfather, the carpenter and gatekeeper of the Breda plantation. It was under Pierre Baptiste's patient tutelage that Toussaint received his first taste of structured learning, not in grand classrooms or ornate libraries, but under the open sky, amid the constant hum of plantation life. From these humble beginnings, Toussaint absorbed the power of ideas. Later, his letters would reveal traces of a profound and unlikely influence. The wisdom of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who, like Toussaint, had once lived in bondage. From Epictetus, Toussaint drew lessons in endurance, discipline, and the invincibility of the human spirit. Lessons he would later wield like armor in the brutal arena of revolution. His speeches, too, carried echoes of another mind. Machiavelli, the cunning architect of statecraft and survival. In Toussaint's measured words, his careful manipulation of enemies and allies alike, one could hear the soft tread of Machiavellian strategy. A leader who knew that sometimes survival demanded not purity, but brilliance. And perhaps, somewhere in the quiet moments, Toussaint pondered the fiery predictions of Abbé Raynal, the French Enlightenment thinker whose writings dared to envision a world where the oppressed would rise and shatter their chains. Raynal's words spoke of revolution, not as a distant dream, but as an inevitable storm waiting to break over the West Indies. Toussaint's education was a patchwork, a blend of the sacred and the practical. His Catholic faith, deeply woven into the rhythm of his life, provided another source of learning. Jesuit and Capuchin missionaries, through sermons and sacraments, imparted to him not only theological knowledge, but a broader sense of moral order, a belief in justice that would shape his leadership. Medicine, too, became part of his arsenal. He learned from the whispered cures and remedies of the African elders, from the healing traditions carried across oceans by men and women whose knowledge survived despite every attempt to erase it. He learned from the Creole communities, and from the more formal teachings practiced in the hospitals founded by the Jesuits and the free people of color. It was a physician's eye he brought to the battlefield later, an understanding of bodies, of wounds, of how life hung by threads too fine for most to see. Yet, for all his learning, literacy itself came slowly. Between 1778 and 1781, legal documents signed on Toussaint's behalf suggest that he could not yet write. His mind could grasp philosophy and strategy, but the pen, the symbol of authority in the colonial world, remained out of his grasp. Throughout the Revolution, Toussaint dictated his letters. Trusted secretaries captured his commands, his ideas, his negotiations. His mind moved too swiftly to be constrained by the slow, painstaking labor of writing by hand. And yet, even here, Toussaint refused to be bound forever. By the twilight years of his life, fragments of his own handwriting began to surface. Clumsy at first, with spelling that clung to the Creole roots of his first tongue, his written French bore the mark not of formal schooling, but of sheer will. It was never about elegance. It was about power. The ability to speak, to dictate, to command, to make himself heard in every hall where decisions were made. By the time the world turned its eyes to him, Toussaint Louverture was no longer merely a man educated by chance and necessity. He was a living synthesis of philosophy and faith, medicine and strategy, dignity and defiance. He was almost ready, and the hour of revolution was almost here. The winds of change that swept through Paris in 1789 did not stop at the shores of France. They crossed oceans, carried on rumor and hope, and arrived with a force that would soon shake Saint-Domingue to its very foundations. At first, it seemed distant, another chapter in the endless intrigues of the Old World. But for the black and mulatto population of the colony, the cries for liberty, equality, and fraternity struck a deep, undeniable chord. Two Creole merchants, Vincent Auger and Julien Raymond, found themselves in France as the first sparks of revolution ignited. Men of wealth, men of education, they bore the legacy of both African and European blood. And yet, in the new revolutionary order being born, they were still denied the rights given freely to their white fathers. It was a betrayal that cut deep. They lobbied the French National Assembly, pleading, demanding, insisting that the wealthy gens de couleur, the free people of color, be granted the full citizenship their status deserved. But the Assembly, still shackled by its own prejudices, turned them away. Auger returned to Saint-Domingue, fury burning in his veins. There, he found an ally in Jean-Baptiste Chauvin, a seasoned veteran of the American Revolution. A man who had already fought and bled for ideals he now saw betrayed once more. Together, they lit a match. In 1790, they organized a rebellion of several hundred free men of color. Armed with little more than hope, rage, and a few scattered weapons, they launched skirmishes against the colonial militias. They fought not to overthrow the system, but to claim their place within it. But Saint-Domingue was not ready. The uprising faltered. Support did not swell as they had hoped. Betrayed by informants, beset by overwhelming force, Auger and Chauvin were captured. Their punishment was as brutal as it was public. Broken on the wheel in the main square of Le Cap, their shattered bodies left as a grim warning to any who dared dream of change. But warnings can backfire. Among the enslaved majority, the sight of Auger's broken body was not a deterrent. It was a rallying cry. Beneath the plantations, in the sugarcane fields, and in the crowded slave quarters, resentment had been brewing for years. The Code Noir, the law that was supposed to offer protection, had been twisted and neglected. Punishments grew harsher, rights eroded. Life became an endless march of labor, hunger, and cruelty. The death of Auger signaled that change would not come through peaceful petitions. It would come through fire. Across the Caribbean, the tremors of the French Revolution ignited new hopes and new fears. In Saint-Domingue, the old order trembled. Many black and freedmen citizens, deeply devout Catholics like Toussaint Louverture, still identified fiercely as Frenchmen loyal to the crown. They clung to the progressive promises made by King Louis XVI and his predecessors, protections that seemed now to be slipping away in the revolutionary chaos. To many, including Toussaint, the struggle ahead was not merely one of race or class. It was a battle to preserve the fragile rights they had been granted, a fight to honor the king's legacy against those who would strip it away. But history is rarely so kind to hopes. The storm was gathering, swift and terrible, and deep within it, Toussaint Louverture was waiting. not as a mere spectator, but as a man ready to seize his destiny. The revolution was no longer coming. It was here, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the thick, heavy air of a Caribbean night, under the canopy of stars and silence, 200 souls gathered in secret. It was August 14th, 1791, a night that would forever change the destiny of Saint-Domingue, and with it, the world. They met at Morne Rouge, a secluded plantation hidden among the northern hills. Slave foremen, Creoles, freedmen, men who had endured lives of endless toil and humiliation, now stood shoulder to shoulder. Whispers passed among them, weighted with fear and fire, for they all knew the price of failure. But they also knew the cost of doing nothing. Among them stood Duddy Boukman, the towering figure whose fierce spirit would ignite the spark. Alongside him, Jean-François Papillon, Georges Biassou, Jeannot Bullet, and a quieter, more cautious figure, Toussaint. Even here, in the shadows, Toussaint's mind moved differently. He understood the need for action, but he also remembered the broken bodies of Auger and Chavannes. He knew that leadership in such a moment was as much a death sentence as it was an honor. When the time came to choose a leader, a single voice to rally the uprising, Toussaint declined. Instead, he stepped forward and nominated Georges Biassou. It was a calculated move, born not of cowardice, but of strategy. Visibility was deadly. In the early days of revolt, survival was as vital as courage. Yet Toussaint did not retreat into the background. He became Biassou's lieutenant and secretary, a man who organized and advised, commanding a small but vital detachment of soldiers. He shaped the rebellion's early strategies, guided negotiations, and began weaving the delicate threads of alliances that would later prove critical. During these dangerous months, Toussaint shed his past name and assumed a new identity, Monsieur Toussaint. It was a bold choice. In the old order of Saint-Domingue, the title Monsieur was reserved exclusively for the white population, a mark of respect and authority. To claim it now was not merely rebellion. It was revolution in every sense of the word. Surviving documents show Toussaint stepping fully into the role of a leader, meeting with fellow commanders, crafting battle plans, and opening channels to the Spanish authorities across the border. Spain, a rival of France, saw in the rebellion a chance to weaken its enemy, and Toussaint, ever pragmatic, seized the opportunity to negotiate for supplies and weapons. Symbols mattered in this new war, and Toussaint chose his carefully. To declare their allegiance to the royalist cause, the old monarchy that had once offered fragile protections, he and his fellow rebels wore white cockades sewn onto their sleeves and crosses of St. Louis across their chests. They fought not just for freedom, but for a vision. A Saint-Domingue where the promises of kings would be honored, where the rights of men, regardless of color, could no longer be denied. In the dark forests and burning fields of the island, the first battles raged. Smoke coiled into the sky. The earth trembled beneath the march of new armies. And at the heart of it all, the man who had once been called Fatras Bâton, the sickly stick, stood unshaken, guiding the storm with a steady hand and an iron will. The revolution had found its architect, and soon the world would know his name. A few nights after the secret gathering at Morne Rouge, the flames of revolution were truly lit. In the thick woods of Bois Caïman, under a sky heavy with rain and prophecy, a Vodou ceremony marked the public beginning of the great uprising. The drums, the chants, the prayers to old spirits, all called forth the spirits of defiance that had slept too long. It was a night that would echo forever across the Caribbean and beyond. But on that night, Toussaint Louverture remained in the shadows. He understood that revolution was not just a war of weapons, but a war of survival. And first, he had a duty to protect those he loved. As the fires of rebellion ignited across the north, Toussaint worked quietly and deliberately. He sent his family to safety across the border into Spanish Santo Domingo, far from the reach of vengeance and reprisal. But his sense of loyalty did not end with his blood. Bayon de Libertad, the very man who had once shielded Toussaint from the brutal punishments of the Breda plantation, was now a marked man. White overseers were hunted with no mercy, and Bayon's life hung by a thread. Toussaint, refusing to abandon the debt of honor he owed, hid Bayon and his family deep within the woods. close to a rebel camp. He brought them food, shielded them from discovery, and eventually orchestrated their escape from the island entirely. Even as the revolution burned all around him, Toussaint remembered the simple, enduring power of loyalty. In the years that followed, as his own fortunes rose like a tide, he continued to support Bayon de Libertad's family, sending aid as they resettled first in the United States, then in France. But duty to individuals did not distract Toussaint from the greater cause. As the rebellion surged, he moved carefully into a new role, one of negotiator, strategist, statesman. In 1791, as battles raged and the colonial order crumbled, Toussaint found himself involved in delicate negotiations between the rebel leaders and the French governor Blancheland. The rebels demanded dignity, an end to the lash, an extra day of rest each week, the freedom of imprisoned comrades. In exchange, they offered peace, a return to the fields, the resumption of labor, stability for a colony spinning toward chaos. Blancheland rejected the terms. The talks collapsed, and in the fragile moments that followed, rage nearly consumed the rebel forces. Biassou's men, their hearts filled with fury, prepared to slaughter the white prisoners they held. But Toussaint intervened. With words, with presence, with sheer force of will, he stayed their hands. He argued not for mercy, but for strategy. Blood spilled in vengeance would only harden the resolve of their enemies. Their cause needed legitimacy, not butchery. The prisoners were spared. Under Toussaint's command, they were escorted safely to Le Cap, a journey fraught with risk and suspicion. At its end, Toussaint hoped to stand before the colonial assembly, to present the demands of a people who refused to be silent any longer. But the assembly refused to meet. They turned their backs on the outstretched hand of negotiation, choosing instead to cling to the crumbling privileges of a dying world. The door to peace closed, and with it, the path to full revolution swung wide open. Toussaint Louverture had tried diplomacy. Now, he would prepare for war. By 1792, Toussaint Louverture was no longer a name whispered in secret meetings or quiet villages. He was becoming a force of nature, an emerging legend whose ambition and brilliance were beginning to reshape the battlefield. Forging an increasingly formal alliance with Spain, Toussaint stepped into a new and dangerous role: commander of La Tannerie, a fortified post guarding the Cordon de l'Ouest, a fragile, crucial line separating rebel-held territory from the colonial strongholds of the French. From this strategic position, Toussaint ran his forces with a discipline that startled even seasoned generals. His men were not ragged bands of angry rebels. They became soldiers, trained in guerrilla warfare, masters of ambush and rapid strikes, but also schooled in the European style of war. Line formations, coordinated attacks, drills that echoed those of professional armies. Toussaint demanded it all, and his men delivered. Yet discipline was not enough. Toussaint understood that true strength came not just from weapons, but from unity. In a land fractured by race, color, and caste, he spoke a language powerful enough to bind them all together. Brotherhood, fraternity. He rallied Creoles, Africans, freedmen, and even some whites, invoking the Republican ideals sweeping the Atlantic world. He called them to a cause greater than vengeance, greater than survival, the creation of something new, something none had ever seen on the blood-soaked soil of the Caribbean. Through his words and his leadership, he forged a new kind of army, an army bound not by blood or heritage, but by shared purpose. The mark of his leadership, strict discipline tempered by the bonds of brotherhood, would define him, setting him apart from all others in the turbulent years to come. But revolution is never without loss. After hard fighting, La Tannerie fell in January 1793. French General Étienne Maynaud de Bizefranc de Lavaux, a man who would later become both adversary and ally, led the assault that drove Toussaint's forces back. It was a bitter defeat, and yet it marked a turning point. For even in defeat, the French took notice. They recognized in Toussaint Louverture something dangerous, something profound, a leader who commanded not just men, but loyalty, vision, and the fierce momentum of history itself. It was during this tumultuous time that Toussaint embraced a new identity. He took up the name Louverture, from the French word meaning opening. Some said it was for his uncanny ability to break enemy lines, to find cracks in even the strongest defenses. Others claimed it was a tribute shouted by a French commissioner, amazed at the ease with which Toussaint made an opening everywhere. Still others, in quieter moments, joked that it referred to the small gap between his front teeth, a simple human reminder that even legends are made of flesh and blood. But no matter its origin, the name stuck. Toussaint Louverture, the one who opened the way, the one who would tear down empires, build new nations, and force the world to see what once seemed impossible. And this was only the beginning. The year was 1793, and Saint-Domingue stood at the crossroads of history. Toussaint Louverture, once a cautious lieutenant in the shadows of revolution, now rose toward a destiny that even he could scarcely have imagined. Though he had long clung to royalist ideals, loyalty to kings, to the stability of tradition, the language of the French Revolution had seeped into his soul. Liberty, equality, brotherhood. They were no longer distant dreams whispered in the salons of Paris. They had become the rallying cries of the fields, the forests, the mountains of Saint-Domingue. What had begun as bargaining for better conditions had transformed irrevocably into a call for complete and total freedom. But freedom had its own battlefield. In May of 1793, rebel leaders Jean-François and Georges Biassou, enticed by promises of land, privileges, and the recognition of liberty for soldiers and their families, formally allied with the Spanish crown. Toussaint, after cautious calculation, followed in early June. The Spanish offered more than the French Republicans dared. In those days, the choice seemed clear: to fight under a king who promised protection, or to place fragile hopes in a revolutionary France that had offered little but rejection and bloodshed. Toussaint had, in fact, already made overtures to French General Laveaux, seeking terms for alliance. But his conditions, bold, uncompromising, had been refused, and so he turned his banners towards Spain. When the civil commissioners in Le Cap issued a radical proclamation on June 20th, offering conditional freedom to slaves willing to fight for the French Republic, Toussaint answered not with silence, but with clarity. The blacks wanted to serve under a king, and the Spanish king offered his protection. The revolution within Toussaint's soul was now complete. On August 29, 1793, standing at Camp Tourelle, Toussaint Louverture spoke not just as a soldier, but as a visionary. His voice rang out across the hills and fields, carried on the breath of 1,000 hopes. Brothers and friends, I am Toussaint Louverture. Perhaps my name has made itself known to you. I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in Saint-Domingue. I am working to make that happen. Unite yourselves to us, brothers, and fight with us for the same cause. It was a declaration of war, not just against France, not just against the Grand Blancs, but against a world built on cruelty and oppression. That same day, desperation finally forced the hand of the French commissioner, Léger Félicité Sonthonax. In a sweeping move, he proclaimed emancipation for all enslaved people in French-controlled Saint-Domingue. It was a breathtaking moment, but the black leaders hesitated. They knew Sonthonax was overstepping his authority. Could promises made on the brink of collapse truly be trusted? The answer came months later, when, on February 4th, 1794, the revolutionary government in Paris formally abolished slavery across all French territories. Now, the ground shifted again. For months, Toussaint had been quietly negotiating, sending secret messages to General Laveaux, feeling out new alliances even as he battled old foes. His ambitions had grown beyond simple rebellion. He was no longer content to be one leader among many, and the Spanish, once generous, had begun to look on him with suspicion. They saw the truth. Toussaint Louverture was no man's pawn. He was building his own power, carving out an autonomous stronghold, a kingdom in all but name. His armies were no longer ragged bands, but disciplined forces, loyal to him above all others. The days of allegiance to Spain were numbered. Toussaint Louverture was opening a new path. One no king, no republic, no empire could control. And the world had only just begun to realize the unstoppable force it had unleashed. In the final months of 1793, Toussaint Louverture's star continued to rise, brilliant and unstoppable. His auxiliary forces, fighting under the Spanish banner, delivered staggering victories. Half of all Spanish territorial gains north of the Artibonite River in the west could be traced to his commands. In December, his forces captured the vital port town of Gonaives, a gateway to the northern seas, a jewel of strategic power. Toussaint had become indispensable to the Spanish cause. But power breeds suspicion. The harmony that had once existed between Louverture and his Spanish superiors began to fray. His trusted ally, Matias de Armona, was replaced by Juan de Leonart, a man who viewed Toussaint and his black auxiliaries with thinly veiled disdain. The fragile alliance began to crack when Biassou, a fellow rebel general and now a bitter rival, began stealing supplies meant for Louverture's forces, and worse, selling the captured women and children into Spanish slavery. Leonart stood by in silence. No justice was offered. No support was given. In a world swirling with betrayal, Toussaint once again stood apart. Unlike Jean-François and Biassou, he refused to sanction the rounding up and selling of the very people they had once vowed to free. His army, forged through brotherhood and discipline, would not be corrupted. But in the cold calculations of Spanish command, this moral stand became a mark against him, a reminder that Louverture was not a man to be controlled. It solidified his inferior status among the trio of black generals in their eyes, a cap on his ambitions, a cage he would not long accept. Then came Gonaives. On April 29, 1794, the Spanish garrison at Gonaives was rocked by a sudden, brutal assault. Black troops, bearing arms in the name of the King of the French, swept through the town. 150 men lay dead. The white guardsmen of the surrounding countryside hunted down, their patrols vanishing into the wilds. The town, once a Spanish stronghold, became a ghost, its people scattered by terror. Suspicion immediately fell on Louverture, though he protested his innocence in a letter dated May 5th, supported by the commander of the Gonaives garrison, who noted that Louverture's signature was missing from the rebels' ultimatum. Doubt lingered. Privately, Toussaint had already crossed the Rubicon.